Hi, today we're going to talk about grief and what that has to do with the dementia caregiver. Let me ask you a few questions though as we get started. Think about how you felt during the last several months. How would you describe yourself? Happy, fearful, angry, sad, tired, forgetful, numb and empty, guilty, disappointed, hopeless, irritable, shocked, unable to eat or sleep, and feeling pain? What have you thought about during that time? How unfair life is? How angry you are with the person with dementia for being the way they are? What you wish you had done differently? How you're going to cope with everything that's happening? How this is not what either of you had planned for this stage in your life? How disappointed you are in someone you thought that you could depend on? How many times have you wondered if there was something wrong with you, if you were going crazy, if anyone else felt this way at all? Today, we're going to talk about grief. So what's grief got to do with any of this? Everything that I just asked about is either an emotion, a thought, or an action that you may experience as a result of grief. We typically think of grief as a response to death, but it's really a natural but often intense response to any loss. It's the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. Everyone experiences grief of some intensity many times in their lives. There's the loss of a pet, loss of social support when you move to a new town for work, loss of a job, or a divorce, just to name a few. Grief is really a process of learning to let go and accept and live with whatever your loss is. When we talked about the loss of a person, grief is the way you adjust to a different relationship with that person. It's also a reflection of the love you have for that person. There's a quote that I particularly like from the Live Purposely Now website. It says this: grief is the last act of love we have to give to those we love. Where there is deep grief, there was great love. How intense grief is, what it feels like, and how long it lasts is very individualized for every person and for every loss. How you experience grief is just as unique as your fingerprint. Even though we all have had experience with grief, the grief associated with having a loved one with dementia is unique in many ways. As caregivers, we experience several types of pre-death grief, which contribute to a different grief journey than what is typical. Some overlapping characteristic occurs in each of these types of pre-death grief, but each also has some unique characteristics. We're going to talk about 4 of them today. One type of pre-death grief is ambiguous loss. This is the most stressful kind of loss that you can have. It's a loss that's not easily defined because it lacks finality and clarity. It happens when a person may be physically present, but psychologically absent. And it's sometimes referred to as the goodbye without leaving. Gradual losses that occur during dementia make it impossible to determine the specific point at which an individual is no longer the person he or she once was. Is the person living with dementia still a parent or a spouse, or is he a child? Is there even a relationship that exists when he no longer recognizes you? Ambiguous grief creates a paradox, that is, an apparent contradiction that is true. And as humans, we have a lot of trouble getting our mind and our feelings around any kind of paradox. Each time the person living with dementia's function returns to a more normal state, the hope for reconnection and recovery may be renewed, which makes dealing with the actual loss even more difficult. One of the things that I remember happened when my husband had a couple of years before he died with his dementia is that he had a day that he seemed really together and really know what was going on, which was unusual. When I left from seeing him that day, I called our younger daughter and I said to her, "Boy, your dad was really making connections today." Her response to me was this: "Mom, my dad doesn't have any connections anymore. He just has a bunch of loose wires hanging down, and sometimes they bump into each other." My normal, or more normal, was to her just wires bumping together. We cannot resolve ambiguous grief, no matter what we do, until a person dies. The second kind of pre-death grief is chronic sorrow. The concept of chronic sorrow was first talked about in regards to children with developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities or chronic health conditions and their caregivers. It's a repeated pattern of recurring and new losses that over time increase in severity. It continually triggers grief because of the recurrence of these losses. And the feelings of chronic sorrow are fed by the overwhelming responsibility and the endless task of caregiving. It can easily lead to depression and anxiety. The third kind of pre-death grief is called disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised means that we're deprived of our right to something. In disenfranchised grief, our grief is not publicly acknowledged or sanctioned. Disenfranchised grief occurs because losses are difficult to define. They may fluctuate, and they're often not recognized by others. Think about showtime in the person who has dementia. If we are experiencing disenfranchised grief, we may feel the need to constantly hide grief to keep from making others feel uncomfortable, or for fear that we'll be alienated ourselves because we're the only person who sees the world this way. This results in our carrying grief alone without meaningful social recognition or support. If grief is not acknowledged, recognized, or understood by others, it only adds to the grief and makes one feel more alone. The fourth kind of pre-death grief is anticipatory grief. This type of grief was first identified in those with predictable terminal illnesses. It's a feeling of loss of a loved one before their actual death. It can be equivalent in intensity and breadth to the grief that occurs after a person dies. And it may result in decreased level of grief or a quicker recovery from grief after a person living with dementia dies. Anticipatory grief is a deep sadness that's felt as the terminal illness progresses. It creates mixed emotions when we are trying to maintain hope and simultaneously begin to let go. There's a quote from the Visiting Nurse Service of New York that describes anticipatory grief better than any other I've read. Here it is. Watching your loved one slip away, step by terrible step, knowing you can't stop the decline, and grieving the loss of the person you once knew before they're actually gone. That just about says it all. So what then is dementia grief? It's a unique combination of all four of these recognized kinds of pre-death grief that arises from witnessing the gradual death of a loved one's personality and memory. The person living with dementia dies psychologically long before he dies physically. Communication between the care partner and the person living with dementia is compromised. This results in multiple changes in relationship quality, family roles, and in care partner freedom. The disease trajectory for dementia is long and unpredictable. Losses are compounded during this process. That means they occur in quick succession and build up over time to create overwhelming anxiety and unpredictable emotional upheaval and losses, which even makes them more overwhelming. The intensity of grief that we feel as a caregiver is often highest at the time of diagnosis of the dementia and as death nears. But it may also peak at a time that the person living with dementia moves to a facility. Before we go on, I need to talk briefly about one other concept. That's the concept of complicated grief. Complicated grief is an ongoing, heightened sense of grief that keeps you from healing. There is intense sorrow, pain, and rumination over the loss of a loved one. A person experiencing complicated grief can focus on little except that person's death. They have trouble resuming their own life. And complicated grief requires professional help to resolve. Complicated grief occurs in about 15% of individuals who've lost a loved one, but in 20 to 30% of dementia caregivers. That's one of the reasons that we have frequently encouraged caregivers to consider counseling during the course of progress of their loved one's dementia. There's several models or stages that talk about how grief progresses. You may be familiar with the ones that were written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross a number of years ago. Although models or stages frequently don't apply to an individual person, the most important thing to remember when you think about grief is something I said very early in this presentation. Grief is as individualized as your fingerprint. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, and no specific length of time to complete the grief journey. Grief doesn't go in a straight line. It goes back and forth, up and down, and sometimes around in circles. We might not ever get over grief. In fact, many studies suggest that we don't. But the intensity lessens over time so that it has less control over our lives. There are two analogies for how we could look at grief and how we begin to move forward that I particularly like. One talks about the fact that grief doesn't go away. If you drew a circle of your life today and colored in the part of that circle that was grief, it may take up all or nearly all of the circle of your life. However, as you resolve grief, that circle doesn't shrink, but over time, your life grows around your grief. You become a bigger person with the grief as only a part of who you are. The other analogy is to think of your life as a puzzle. Before dementia, you knew where you were going, and the puzzle of your life may have been almost complete. Suddenly, the diagnosis of dementia grabs all your puzzle pieces and throws them to the floor. Now your life is about putting those pieces back together, but you only have half the puzzle pieces that you started with. You can put the puzzle back together again, but it will look different from what it did originally. So what helps us? when so many things are going on with grief. As we talk about what helps, you'll notice that each suggestion ties directly to one or more of our previous lessons in this series. That is the exact purpose of these basics classes, to tie information together so that you see new ways of looking at things and identify new possibilities for making your journey and that of the person living with dementia more gentle. The first thing we can do is acknowledge our losses. One way to do this is to list the loss, date it, and put it in a box. Identifying losses as being perceptive. I identified and acknowledged the losses that Roy experienced and I experienced frequently by sharing them with my daughters. Allow yourself to grieve. Grief doesn't mean you're giving up hope. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. You need to feel however you feel. Healing happens if you grieve along the way. You can grieve by feeling something like sadness, hopelessness, loneliness, anger, or guilt. But you can also grieve by doing things like getting practical information, finding solutions to problems, doing things for yourself and the person living with dementia. Most people blend these two styles of grieving. Allowing yourself to grieve is a good stress management technique. You also have to be proactive, perceptive, and persistent in accomplishing this. Find ways to take control. One of the ways you do this is through the knowledge of what to expect. Even if you can't control what's going on around you, you can control your thoughts and your reactions. That's being proactive. Be positive by maintaining a sense of humor. I frequently laughed with Roy, even when I had no clue what he had just said. He would say something, often using a jumble of words, or sometimes even words that weren't really words, and then look at me and laugh. I laughed along with him because I knew whatever he had said in his mind, he thought was funny. Find and create moments of joy is another way to be positive. We often focus on our connection to another person through language. In most people with dementia, language is affected, sometimes very early on in the process. Instead of language, pay attention to what you can communicate through the tone of your voice, body language, touch, affection, and music. Roy was very fond of music his whole life. During the last couple of years of life, there was never a time that music wasn't playing in his room. Connect with others. That's also being proactive. Spend time with people who understand you and support you. This may be friends or it may be a support group. Accept help from others. Ask for help if you need to. And seek counseling if that helps you with this connection. Practice forgiveness. That's one of the stress management techniques that Pat talked about recently. Forgive yourself for not being perfect. Don't feel guilty. Confusion and doubt are not signs of failure. Knowing this allows you to let go of trying to fix things and instead just do the best you can. One of the most important things to remember here is that the person living with dementia is always doing the best they can, and the caregiver is always doing the best he or she can too. Take care of yourself. Did you know that dementia caregivers die at a rate that is 63% higher than their non-caregiving peers? Eat well, sleep, exercise. The question of how to be a good caregiver has many answers, but taking care of yourself is always one of them. You're now the most important person in your family, so finding time for yourself is essential. That also means finding a little bit of time for some normal activities, even if that's only 10 minutes a day. Taking care of yourself is another stress management technique, but it requires persistence to really carry through. Find meaning in what you're doing. Accept that you will never know the answers to all your questions or problems, but have confidence and faith that things will work out. Know that you are gaining strength from coping. That's being perceptive too. Finding meaning in what I was doing is what got me through. I don't believe that God does things to us to teach us lessons. Much of what happens to us in the world that's bad is just because we live in an imperfect world. I do believe that we always have the option to choose to learn from what we are going through, however. And lastly, consider holistic methods of coping. They can be good stress management tools. Think about guided imagery, meditation, mindfulness, massage, art, music, and maybe journaling. In closing, I'd like to share with you a quote that I think is particularly helpful. And here it is. If there's ever a tomorrow when we're not together, there's something you must remember. You're braver than you believe, and stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. That's the sage advice that Christopher Robin gave to Winnie the Pooh in Pooh's Grand Adventure. And finally, here's a slide for some resources that may help you in your grief journey. They are resources that I found particularly helpful. You can take a picture of this slide, or if you're looking at this on YouTube, you can pause the video long enough to get a picture or to write down these references. I hope you find this helpful in thinking about the grief you're experiencing and identifying that grief so that it may be easier for you to deal with during this dementia journey.